Time for our 360 round. We're breaking down today's consumer sentiment data. For that, I want to bring in our panel. Joining us now, we've got Tsvetta Kaleynska, consulting founder and CEO of Ryla Global, and Mark Hamrick, Bankrate, a senior economic analyst and Washington bureau chief. All right, Tsvetta, let's start with you. We had a big jump in this consumer sentiment survey for June. It's the biggest increase since the start of the year. It does diverge from the consumer confidence data, the weakness that we saw from the conference board earlier this week. What's your take on how the consumer is shaking out based on this?
Hey, Diane, great to see you, and thanks for having me on the show. So I analyze consumer sentiment based on what people say online on a social media platform like, say, Facebook or Instagram. Here is what I see when it comes to sentiment. Only 2% of all of the 170,000 posts that happened on a social media platform in the last week were positive. And those were really driven by two key segments, which were supporting local and staying local. So US focus, again, this is part of the wave of the China tariff discussion. And the second positive sentiment driver was summer travel, because we are in the holiday season. When it comes to negative sentiment, though, what I see is actually a 24% negative sentiment among the US consumer, which obviously has been driving the discussion about personal consumption expenditures. And the three key drivers for that are healthcare spending, discretionary spending, and the future of spending among young Americans, which I'd love to dive deeper into once my guest fellow panelist also jumps in.
Mark, I want to get your thoughts on the report, the consumer sentiment data that we got today. How do you interpret that upswing in sentiment? Do you think it's a longer-term trend that we'll see or a temporary shift?
I would say we should make a mountain out of the speed bump. Diane, good to see you. Obviously, as you said earlier, the consumer confidence reading we got earlier in the week from the conference board went in the opposite direction. Our own Bankrate survey of consumer sentiment we did recently found that 65% of Americans believe the tariffs will be negative for their personal finances. I think we're going to be in a tariffs world for the foreseeable future, but obviously the market's trading on every single development or even the perception of a development in that realm. And so, if we think about the other economic data that we've gotten this week, I think that we could be, and I don't mean to steal perhaps one of your next questions from you, but I think we may be in a situation where we're seeing better alignment between the soft data and hard data, meaning the actual performance of the economy versus attitudes, but it's maybe too early to make that confident judgment.
No, Mark, listen, we've been wondering when that shift would happen because, there are many other experts who share a similar viewpoint to you and economists that I've talked to that they're expecting we're going to return to a pre-pandemic pattern where the soft data was a leading indicator. So, Tsvetta, let's talk a little bit more about your social sentiment data that you track. What do you make of that disconnect between what you're noticing and then what we're seeing in this UMich survey?
Yeah, I actually can just piggyback on what actually Mark covered. So we are in the China discussion, and basically we're going to be seeing the repercussions of the China tariffs. And that's what I actually see. So if I had to dive deeper into the data, I think that a lot of the negative sentiment, which is at 24%, as I mentioned, is driven really by China tariffs, the labor market, the AI job displacement, and again, concerns about general unemployment. When it comes to the actual discussions on the personal consumption expenditures and what really concerns the US public, over the last week alone, they mentioned that healthcare spending was at the top of their mind. So that was the top theme of the last week. 25% of all of the 170,000 posts that I actually analyzed mentioned that users were discussing anything related to healthcare. So that's your insurance premiums, your hospital services, prescription drugs, etc., because they do tie those back to the discussions about the China tariffs. And again, let's not forget that the healthcare spending in the US accounts for roughly 16 to 18%. The second key theme was discretionary spending, and that also ties back into what we were covering earlier, which is that 23% of the posts that I analyzed consumers mentioned that they are actually cutting back on discretionary spending. And there is a huge value-oriented purchase shift, which if we actually saw that also in the retail earnings data from last quarter's performance. And the third key theme is that the future of spending.
Tsvetta, I got to jump in because we are losing time here. I do appreciate the data that you're sharing with us. I just want to give Mark enough time to give us a final thought because we've got about a minute left of our conversation. Mark, final thought from you on what you're expecting in terms of patterns as it relates to the consumer, particularly in the second half of this year.
Well, I think I just follow up on what we just heard, and that is the risk is that actual discretionary spending declines as we see increases in prices. That's the baseline expectation at this point. The Fed in its most recent meeting said we should see PCE measures with 3% handles by the end of the year. And so there's less money to pay for all of that. If we see a further weakening of the job market, that's going to be very concerning because that's going to be sort of pulling another leg out under the stool of some things that have been supporting the U.S. economy.
All right. Thank you, Mark. That's Mark Hamrick, Senior Economic Analyst, Bankrate, and Tsvetta Kaleynska, the CEO of Ryla Global. Thank you both.